Today I want to talk to you about emergency funds, and I promise you, I'm not going to give you the cliche 3 to 6 months living expenses, because if I hear that one more time, it is going to make my head explode. It's so vague and it drives me nuts. So I promise you, in this video, I'm going to go through the real factors that should go into figuring out how much you need for an emergency fund, and also tell you how I created my kind of unorthodox emergency fund and why I think it's going to be successful for me. Before we dive into that, if you are new to the channel, my name is Brad. I make videos with tips and motivation on how to get out of debt, save money, invest for retirement, all in the hopes of reaching financial independence. If that sounds like something that might interest you, consider subscribing and hit that bell notification so you get told every single time I release a video or I go live. After recently becoming debt-free, the next step in Dave Ramsey's plan would be what he calls Baby Step 3, or the emergency fund. And ever since day one of when I've gotten my personal finances in order, I've always heard that the emergency fund was a, quote, 3 to 6 months of living expenses. And to me, this really didn't help me at all. So while paying off my debt and researching over the last 2 years, I figured out what really works for me as far as what a good emergency fund is, how I figure out how much I need an emergency fund, and then where I'm going to put it. There's really a couple factors that I put into place when figuring out what my emergency fund is going to be. And you could do the same. The first is really, what are your expenses? And the reason I tell you that is because if you have $100 worth of expenses every month, as opposed to somebody that has $10,000 worth of expenses every month, your emergency fund has to be different. It all depends on what you have as far as expenses. So I think before you start worrying about what your emergency fund should be, I think you really need to have a grasp on what your expenses are. If you have a large amount of expenses, naturally you're going to need a larger emergency fund. And somebody with not a lot of expenses, they might be able to dial theirs back a little bit. The next thing I took into consideration when figuring out what my emergency fund was going to be was how much money I make. What's my income? And how does that income really relate to my expenses? If my income is pretty much on par with my expenses, that's going to change my framework on what my emergency fund's going to be. And it really should be for you too. Where if you have these really, really large expenses and really, really low income, you might want to work on building that income up. For me personally, my income, pretty much every single time I get paid, I cover 1 month's living expenses. Which leads me into my next factor when determining what my emergency fund should be. And that is job security. Like I just said, every single time I get paid, I cover 1 month's living expenses. So if I had a really secure job, I know that every single time I get paid, I can accumulate 1 month. Where if maybe you don't know about your job's future and you don't have a lot of job security, you might want to start thinking about what your expenses are, how much money can you save, and how long would it take you to get a job if you lost your job. I'm a public school teacher and I've been in the system for 15 years. The likelihood of me losing my job is very, very low. But if you're somebody that might lose their job and it's going to take you possibly 6 months to find a job in your field, then now we're looking at that 6 months emergency fund, because you're going to need money while you're looking for a new job. So after you've looked at your expenses and how that relates to your income and how long you might have a job, there's really only one thing left that you need to decide. What is an emergency and what does that mean to you? Your emergency might be different than my emergency. Let me give you an example. If I'm riding my bike and I fall and I break my arm, my insurance through my employer is going to cover the cost of those medical bills. So breaking my arm for me financially is not really an emergency. But if you don't have great medical coverage or you don't have any coverage at all, a broken bone might be a monumental emergency. That's what brings us personalized into it. You have to determine A, what you think is an emergency, and B, how much that worst case scenario emergency will be for you. So I'll give you kind of a general idea of where I'm at for the people that are new to the channel. My expenses are relatively low, especially for New York where I live. I don't have any debts. I don't have any car payments. I pretty much pay for my 4 walls. I pay for utilities. I pay for my mortgage. I pay for food, daycare, all the general things we don't really spend outside our means. So my expenses are pretty low, and they are definitely low in comparison to my income. Not only are they low in comparison to my income, but my job is super, super secure. Essentially, I get paid every single week. So if I have a major emergency, I know that I really just need to get to that Friday and an entire month's living expenses is going to be covered. And I'm even more fortunate that my wife is in the exact same situation. So even if I lost my job, we would have to both lose our jobs on the same day to really get ourselves into a lot of trouble. So for me, my emergency fund really needs to be one paycheck away, or my worst case scenario. I think my worst case scenario is if something happened with my house and I had to pay out my deductible, which is $5,000. So for me, really, a worst case scenario is if a tree branch fell through my roof and I had to lay out a $5,000 deductible to get it fixed. Around that $5,000 range is really where I want to put my emergency fund. As long as I have $5,000, I know that I'm pretty much going to be okay. And it has nothing to do with my living expenses. It has nothing to do with what people tell me in blogs. It really has to do with what works best in my scenario based around my expenses, how much money I make, my job security, and what my worst case scenario is for an emergency. Guys, this is a personal journey, and with emergencies and with money, there's a huge comfort level here. Do not let anybody make you feel like you're not doing the right thing, or you don't have enough saved for an emergency fund, or you have too little saved for an emergency fund. Even when you're in Dave Ramsey's Baby Step 1, if that $1,000 feels like BS to you, then do what works best for you. Because at the end of the day, you're the one that has to sleep at night, right? You shouldn't just keep money around just for the sake of keeping it around while you're paying off debt. And maybe some of you might want to have no emergency fund. Not really advised, but if you feel okay with that, then go for it. I'm just letting you know what I specifically do, and hopefully that'll help you get past the vagueness of 3 to 6 months living expenses. So I told you, as long as I have $5,000 that I can touch at any time within a day or two's notice, I feel comfortable. So I tell people all the time where my emergency fund money is and how I would cover an emergency if need be. And there's a little bit of controversy there. So let me tell you exactly where I keep and how I keep my emergency fund. First, I keep cash on hand. And when I say cash on hand, I don't mean under the mattress. I mean in my high interest savings account. Not a ton of money. Like I said, really only one paycheck's worth. Not a lot of cash. Definitely not the full 5,000. But I'll tell you this about cash. When I was getting out of debt and thinking about investing and reading all these investment books, I was so afraid to hold cash. And now, after doing some more research, I find out that cash isn't a bad thing to have. It protects you against downswings in the market. It might be there for a possible real estate investment later on. It's there for a personal loan. There's ways that you can use cash to benefit your life. So to be honest, I've always kept a low amount of cash because I thought my money needed to, quote, be working for me. To be honest, I'll probably start to build that cash up. But right now, pretty much just one paycheck's worth is sitting in cash. And I've gotten asked this too before. Does my cash in my sinking funds count as an emergency? And once again, it really depends on you. I have sinking funds. I have a ton of sinking funds. There's some sinking funds that I would use in an emergency, and there's some sinking funds I wouldn't. For example, right now I'm saving up for a new computer. If a tree branch falls through my house and I need to cover a deductible, that computer is going to have to wait. That sinking fund would be emptied immediately in the case of an emergency. But I also have another sinking fund for my property taxes to be paid every 6 months. Would I pull from that? No, because I'm not paying my property taxes. I'm not doing the penalties on that. So you have to think if an emergency came, is it more important than the sinking fund item or not? It's as simple as that. And that's when I tell people when they ask me if they should consider sinking fund money part of their emergency fund. So that one wasn't too controversial. That one probably won't get me in too much trouble, but the next one might. I took a poll on Instagram today and asked if Roth IRA contributions should be used as a part of your emergency fund. And 80% of the people voted no. And it got 70 votes. It turns out there are a ton of people that either A, do not think that Roth IRA contributions should be used as emergency fund money, or just flat out won't. And I'm here to tell you, I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to tell you why I consider Roth IRA contributions to be emergency fund money. And here's why. First and foremost, there's a misconception here about the penalty of taking out funds. Guys, you have contributions, money that you put into your 401k. Right now, you could put in $6,000 a year. In years past, it was $5,500, $500. It goes up every so often. Then, those contributions raise. You get a gain. As the stock market goes up, those contribution amounts, they will continue to rise. But that difference between the contribution amount and what your account is at right now, that capital gain is the only thing that gets penalized if you take it out before 59 and a half. So if I put $6,000 into my Roth IRA this year and I max it out, then tree branch falls through my house. I have a $5,000 deductible. I can go right back into that Roth IRA, take the contribution back out, that $6,000 that I need, and I will not be penalized at all. And it's surprising to me how many people don't know that. They just know if I pull from my retirement account early, I'm going to be penalized. The contributions that you put in, you can take at any time. Now, if you take old years contributions, you can't pay those back. So like last year, I put in $5,500. So right now I have $5,500 from last year, $6,000 from this year. So right now I can pull all of that money out, tax-free, penalty-free, no big deal. But the only amount of money I'm allowed to put back in would be what the limit is, $6,000. So essentially, I would lose past year's contribution amounts if I pulled that money out. So like I said, this is an emergency situation. I'm not saying that I'm willing just to take that $5,500 out. It would take a monumental emergency for me to have to dip back in. But not many people know that you can go in and get those contributions, and you could do it in 2 or 3 days. You call Vanguard tomorrow morning, that money is going to be distributed back into your bank within 3 business days. So if you have Roth IRA contributions and you're saving up in baby step 3, and you know who I'm talking to because we spoke about it the other day, you might be baby step 3 satisfied right now. And the last most controversial thing that I use, oh gosh, I'm just waiting for the hate comments, and some of you know what I'm going to say. I will use a credit card in the case of an emergency, knowing this, before you get down in the comments, knowing this, let's go back to a couple minutes ago. I have a very, very high income, and I have a low max on my credit cards. I have about $5,000 there. So if need be, if I went through my cash reserve, I pulled out this year's Roth IRA contribution, so now we're talking a $10,000 plus emergency, I would have the availability to take 5 more on a credit card, knowing this, that I would be able to pay it back within a week in my next paycheck. That is the only, I'm not going into debt here for an emergency. I'm not doing that. That defeats what an emergency fund is, right? We want an emergency fund so we don't have to go back into debt. The credit card would be a last resort, but it's still there, and I would not have to pay interest for a whole billing cycle. So if I needed the money, and like I said, monumental emergency, I probably would put it on the credit card knowing that I would have a full month to pay it off. 4 paychecks every single Friday to pay off that emergency and not have to pay any interest on it. I'm really curious because of the amount of people I spoke to and that poll that I did on Instagram today. Get down in the comments. Let me know. Do you use Roth IRA contributions? Are you against it? Did you not know that you could and you might consider that an emergency now? I'm really just curious on that Roth IRA contribution and how that relates to the emergency fund. And you did hear me call it baby step 3 in this video, guys. If you're following the baby steps, that's what it is. If you're not following the baby steps, it's just called an emergency fund to you. But for my Dave Ramsey followers, from what I've learned in my experience, guys, don't necessarily wait to reach that before you start investing. Get your time in the market. You're debt-free. You did the right thing. And, build that emergency fund up slowly. Definitely get some cash. Definitely have that emergency. But also, don't be afraid to invest. And following up what I just said, even if those investments are going into a Roth IRA, okay, that's a way to invest and save an emergency fund at the same exact time. The way I see it, if you put $6,000 into a Roth IRA this year and your spouse puts $6,000 into a Roth IRA this year, you have generated $12,000 of a cash emergency fund that if you do not need, it is going to continue to go up with the stock market and you are going to start letting your money work for you. Until I see you on the next one, stay positive, work really, really hard. Always please be kind to other people. I hope you have yourself an amazing day and even better tomorrow.
No.